and welcome to Darvanalee Design Studio. My name's Nicole Reed, and today I'm going to show you how to turn a big pile of scraps into a gorgeous scrappy binding that you can put onto your quilts. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through the process of sorting out our big pile of scraps from our leftovers from our quilt that we've made, and we're going to go through and I'm going to show you how I sort them out into different piles, and then I trim them all up and I get all different sizes for a scrappy binding. And then I'll show you, normally you would do it on the 45, but this one I actually do a straight binding because we're very limited for fabric, and I wanted to make sure that I had enough, and I needed about 278 inches of binding, and I've got about 300 here, so I'm well within the quilt. And I'll show you a few tips and tricks. So after we've made the binding, I will attach it to the quilt, and I'll just show you some of the things that I do to get perfect mitered corners, and how I finish it off to stop those little puckers happening when you join the two tails together. So let's get started. Okay, so you've just finished a quilt and you've got a ton of scraps left, and so what are you going to do with it? So basically what I'm going to do with this ton of scraps that I've got from a quilt that's been made is actually just make a scrappy binding. So I'm going to turn this pile into something useful. So you can see here we've got all different sizes, some little bits, just all the cut-offs from a quilt that was made. And you would have seen that made that it was quilt number 10 that was in the machine this year, and basically I'll put the card up the top so you'll be able to see that and have a bit of a look and see what I've done on it. So these are all the fabrics that we used in it, and as you can see I've got some multiple different sizes and shapes and all that sort of stuff. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly do some prep work on this with the iron and get some straight pieces, and then I'm just going to cut different types, different sizes, of 2.5 inch strips. We're going to sew them together and turn them into a binding, and then we'll attach them to the quilt. Okay, so we've got our pile of scraps, and I'm going to go through them and get rid of the pieces that I can't use, so they're like too thin or I can't get a 2.5 inch strip out of. And basically I just I grab my ruler, so you'll need a ruler today and a rotary cutter as well, and some matching thread. And I just check to make sure that they're 2.5, so that one is already a 2.5, so I can just quickly give that a press and pop that over here in a pile ready to go. And that one it's probably about 8 inches in length, and it's 2.5 wide, so that's a perfect size. So I will try and get that size out of each one that I use. And I will just put them, like, there's some smaller pieces that are 2.5 as well, so these ones are 4 inches, so they're half, so they might be a good one to just add in as a bit of a filler. So I'll just quickly go through all this and put them in their varying sizes, and they don't all have to be uniformed either, so you can have them in different sizes. So that one that I just done then is actually a little bit longer than the first one I done, so I can just have them in, just set them aside and have them in the different lengths, and then I can work with that. I can trim some off if I need to, or add a small piece into it. Okay, so we've got quite a few larger pieces here that we can cut into strips. So what I'm going to do is basically, I've already got these 2.5 inch strips here, and they're all varying sizes. So I'm going to just leave them as they are, and then I'm going to cut these bigger strips, and hopefully we'll get enough out of it. And we've got a fat quarter that can be added to it as well, that because this is a customer's quilt, so the lady said that that was what she had for the binding. So there's not quite enough there to do the binding on the quilt, so because it's a little bit on the larger size. So I think with the fat quarter and everything that I've got here, I should be able to get enough out of that for the binding. And I've got some grey fabric, some of these fabrics in here as well that I can add in if I need to. So yeah, now I just basically get rid of all the little scraggly bits that we don't need. So out of everything, this is all we're left over with. So as you can see, the pile now, we can't use this much for anything. We could probably get a few hexagons out of it, but on a whole, there's not much we can do with that. So I'm just going to put that back into the bag for the customer, and she can do what she wants with that, but I'm going to turn all this into a gorgeous binding. Alright, so I've worked out how many inches I need of binding. We need 278 inches all up. So basically what I'm going to do is just get cutting, and you can see on some of them have got a bit odd shapes at the end. So basically I'm just going to lay that down of the straight edge along one of the marks on my ruler, on my mat, and then I'm just going to get rid of that bit there. So I've just grabbed my longer ruler and I'll set all the rest of the fabric to the side, and I am just going to lay that up against a straight line because I know I've got a straight edge there. And then, because most of the ones that we already have, they were around the 8-inch mark, so I'm just going to between 8 and 9 they were, so I'll just probably cut most of them at that. So that's our 2.5 inch strip. And so I've got 2 out of that. One's slightly longer, but that's okay because we're going for a scrappy look anyway. Alrighty, so I'm just going to keep doing that with all the pieces that I've got here. Okay, so we've cut all our strips now, and basically what we're going to do is we're going to do a quick tally and make sure that we've got enough. And I've got this fabric here, but I don't want to cut into it just yet because it is a full fat quarter and I might have enough of the binding here. So I'm just going to do a quick calculation off camera and then I'll know if I've got to cut some more. Okay, so I've got an excess of 300 inches of strips there, so I'll be able to make our binding and I won't need to cut into that fat quarter. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually just going to randomly pull one out and start sewing them together. We're not going to do it on the bias like this today because I don't want to lose too much of the fabric that way. So because we are cutting it fine with it, so I'm going to do a straight edge binding today, which makes no difference whatsoever to the binding because we've cut these across. It'll still go around the quilt properly. I'll still get perfect mitered corners and all that sort of stuff, so we don't need to really worry about it. And more often than not, I do actually do my quilts like this because I do a lot of scrappy bindings, and you have to be more economical with your fabric, especially if you're using the fabrics that are in the quilt. If I was just cutting yardage for my binding, I would definitely put it like this and stitch across here so it opens up like that. But today, because we're limited with what we've got and all these fabrics go with the quilt that it's going on, I've decided that we'll do it across this way. And all I do with this is reduce my stitch length down and press my seams open, and it makes it sit flat just as if it was done on the bias. The machine's all threaded, so I'm going to be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and basically what I'm going to do is just basically feed a couple of strips together like 2 in 2s, and then I'll add them to another and then them to another and just keep going like that. It'll just speed up the process a little bit, and I just try to make them as random as possible. And I'm not worrying about the length or anything like that. We've got a good variant of lengths and stuff like that, so it makes it a little bit easier. and gives it a really nice scrappy look as well. Okay, so that's our last bit through, and you can see there that it's really scrappy looking. So it's a good variation of colours. We had a little bit more check, so there's a little bit more check in there. So I'm going to head over to the ironing pad and we're going to start pressing this out. Okay, so basically what we're going to do now is we're just going to turn this into the binding. So when you come to a seam, just press that open. Okay, so you can see there that that's opened nicely. And then basically what I'm going to do is just fold that over like so, with the wrong sides touching. And I'm just going to continue along until I'm finished doing that to all the binding. It's a little bit more work when you do a scrappy binding because you've got so many extra seams, and you know, we've got little pieces of fabric here and we've got bigger pieces of fabric, and I always like to press my seams open when I do it like this. As I said, if I'm cutting straight off the bolt and it's just one colour, I actually do a 45-degree angle stitch joining my strips, but because we were limited for fabric, I've gone this route today, so there's not so much waste. And this should just make it around the quilt. But it's a great way to use up your scraps, and it's less stuff that you've got in your stash, in your scrap stash. So, and it goes with the quilt because you've already used the fabrics in that. This once, I'll actually go back over it again and I will apply pressure with the clapper, and that will keep it nice and give it a nice crisp feel and look to it. So here we are at the end of our binding, and as you can see, it is quite pretty to look at. It's quite even, it's got a good mixture of contrasts. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run the iron over that again, and followed by the clapper, and that way I know that my binding will stay together until I'm ready to use it. But this is pretty much going onto the quilt straight away, so even if I just wanted to at this point start attaching it to the quilt, I very much well can, because it's neatly pressed and whatnot. So I've got my clapper, and I'll put a link in the description below where you can actually get these from. I found a couple of places now that you can get them from, but Amazon's probably the cheapest place to get them, so I will put a link down the bottom for you, so if you want one. They're a great little gadget to have. It's a bit of wood. This particular one is stained. It's probably about 2.5 inches thick, and it's got a little bit of weight to it. So basically what you do is you put your iron on there, and then you take the iron away, and then you put this on, put a little bit of pressure, and it just gives you a really nice crisp seam or crease in what you need. And it's a tailor's tool, it's not a patchworking tool. It's actually, a lot of tailors use these for making creases in pleated skirts and down the front of slacks and things like that. So that's what a clapper is. Okay, so there you go. You can see that our binding's all done. This is all our nice crisp edges, and I've wound that all up. And so now what I've got to do is I've got to just quickly go and trim the quill top, and then I can put the binding on. I'll be all set up at the sewing machine to show you how I put a binding on, and a couple of little tricks that I do just to get that nice finish towards the end. Okay, so we've got our binding and our quilt's all trimmed up, and basically we now want to attach our binding. So we're going to be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I generally start at the bottom of my quilt, sort of not at the center, sort of off to the side a little bit, and I just basically unroll some of my binding, and I usually have it off to my right hand side. And then what I do is I just line up my raw edges, and I'll start about, and I just eyeball it, there's no great measurement there. I sort of just start about maybe 4 to 5 inches away from the tail, so this bit's flapping there. Okay, and when I come back around I've got that much room to move it, and I'll do the same at the other end, but you'll see that as we're going. So basically what I do, I don't worry about pinning or anything like that. I just line up my raw edges, and then I slide it underneath the machine. As I said, I come down about 4 inches, 4 to 5 inches from the edge of that tail. I put my needle in the down position because that makes it easier when I've got to adjust the quilt or anything like that. I don't have to realign my stitching or anything like that. And when I start, I do a back stitch. Yes, I am back stitching for once. I do it there, and then I just sew all the way around the quilt. And I'll show you what I do when I come to a corner, so I can create my mitered corners. And I always just make sure that my raw edges are all aligned, and I'm definitely using my 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then after I've put this on, I'll actually hand sew it onto the back. So I'm coming up to a corner now, and what I do, this is just something that I was taught to do, and it works really well for me. I always get a really good mitered corner, and I actually provide a binding service for people, which, as you can see, this customer is getting that done. And so I create the binding, and then I sew it on, and everybody likes how I do my binding, so I'm quite busy all the time with binding. So we come down to the end, and we don't quite go off the edge, so where the quilt is finishing, just here. Don't know if you can see that. There's the quilt just underneath that. Now I stop about 1/4 inch, and if you've got a newer machine, it'll probably have marks on your presser foot, and you'll be able to line the edge of that quilt up underneath the binding with your 1/4 inch mark. So I'm there right now. So what I do is I actually lift my presser foot, and I turn it to a 45, and what I'm going to do is stitch off to the corner of the quilt. So just like this. Then I can lift that presser foot up, and you can see, I don't know if you can see it there, but I'll just show you. So you can see I've sewn off in like a 45 degree, about a 1/4 inch away from it. So what that does effectively is just creates that nice 45 degree angle, which means then I can just flick it up and fold it back on itself. Okay, and it gives it that little bit of extra security as well. I turn the quilt now, then I lay the quilt flat, and then I just bring it up. So I hold the binding down here, and then I just bring it up, and you can see that that is creating a nice 45 degree angle into the corner of the quilt. So can you see that there? And then I just bring the binding down on itself. Might have to do a little adjusting if you find that it's moving on you, and because the quilt's heavy or whatever, just grab a wonder clip and just hold that top corner up in there, and you can see that's running right along the edge of the quilt now. And I can stitch my 1/4 inch, and I start off here and I do a reverse, and then I go all the way down, and I repeat that for every corner. And what happens is, well, I'll go a little bit further and I'll show you. It gives you it just folds over, and it's a beautiful mitered corner, and it's easy to match up on the back. So I'm going to continue on, and I'll show you what it looks like when we get towards the end. If you find that your quilt's a little bit too heavy, just grab a chair and sit a chair beside you, and it'll hold some of the weight. It'll just stop the quilt from falling onto the floor and pulling out from under the needle. I often do that with all my bigger quilts because they are a bit cumbersome to hold on to, especially when you've got a working bench like I have here on my machine, and just having that the chair beside you when you're working, it just takes some of the weight out of the quilt. And you can see there, I've just added a chair beside me because it wasn't there before, and you can see it is actually going through a little bit easier and it's not moving around as much. So what that means is my 1/4 inch seam allowance will be okay. It won't be wobbly or anything like that. Okay, so I've come around to my last corner. I've finished doing the mitered corner, and I'm heading towards the where I began. So what I do is I actually just come down about 10 inches, maybe a bit more depending on the size of the quilt. This one's quite a large one, so I'll probably come down about 15 to 18 inches. And I'll stop there and I'll just do a reverse just to lock that in place. And this is where I take the quilt out. Okay, so what I do now is we've got our 2 tails. I've trimmed off a little bit longer, so you can see the tail's just that little bit longer than what it needs to be. So this is where the first one is and this one's over it. So basically what we've got to do now is we've got to join these 2 tails so we get a nice finish. So I basically lay it all flat and I use pins or wonder clips to hold the binding into place as if I've already sewn it. And you can see here I'm just laying it flat and pinning it. Okay, and you can use wonder clips as well, that's entirely up to you. So what we're going to do now is, once this is, and I do the bottom one as well, once this one's in place we'll be right to go. Okay, so what I need to do is I've got to butt these 2 up together. So in order to do that, I need to cut a little bit extra off. So I've got to measure a 1/4 inch extra on the top one. Okay, so I put it up against the bottom one. So I've got my ruler just there like that, so you can see that. Okay, and that's even with that end, the raw edge there. Okay, and then I lay this one down. It's a little bit of a fiddly way to do this when you've got when you have to have a straight edge, because you can't exactly do a 45-degree seam because you've done straight all the way and it will actually stand out. So what I do is I just, for this sort of thing, I measure 1/4 inch down. Okay, and then what I can do from there is I trim a little bit extra just to make sure. So you can see there I've gone probably about 1/8 inch past that. But what will happen is I can unpin that now, and I can maneuver this a little bit better now that I've unpinned it. But what I can do is I can actually line these up. Okay, so we'll just fold the quilt up on itself and that'll just give me a little bit more room. Okay, and we just put them right sides together, and I've made that mark there and I know that that's where I'm going to sew. And so I'll put a pin in there to hold it in place. And then what I do is I just sew using the white fabric as my guide for my seam, so that will be a 1/4 inch. Bit of reverse. Get our thread snips. Okay, and what happens when we open up the quilt again, so that was all folded on itself, you can see there, whoops, that is just going to lay nice and flat all the way along, and it matches the rest of the quilt. Okay, so I hope that made sense, because it's a little bit different than what you would normally do a binding, because normally you would do it on a 45-degree seam. So what I do is I just go back up to where I finished off, and I go back a couple of stitches. I line my binding up, and again I do a bit of a reverse. See here, here's the join that we had. Gone over that, it's sitting nice and flat like the rest of them, and then we're coming up to our where we started our stitching. It just slipped on me. Alright, and we're up to our stitching again, so that's where I started, and there our binding is attached. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you like this little tutorial on how to make a scrappy binding. It's a great way to use up your scraps, and you don't have to do it with the fabrics that you used in your quilt either. You can actually do it with any of your scraps and just make up your bindings, and that way it's being very frugal with your fabric that you have, and you don't have an ever-growing pile of scraps multiplying in your basket. So get in there, have a go, and the next quilt you do, put a scrappy binding on it. I know that you'll be pleasantly surprised. I've done a few now, and I do actually like the process of doing it. And just remember to reduce your stitch length when you're sewing your binding strips together. If you don't have a lot of binding, you can always do it butted on, but you can do it the other way as well, so you get that 45-degree angle between all your strips. It is a bit of a time-consuming way of making a binding, but it's well worth the effort. So thank you very much for joining me today. As always, if you like this video, please give us a thumbs up down below. Leave us a comment, because we'd love to hear what you've got to say. Do you have any tips or tricks for your scrappy bindings? Let us know below. And if you're new to our channel and this is the first time you're watching us, please subscribe and hit the little bell icon beside it, and that way you won't miss out on any future crafty posts. My name is Nicole Reid for Darvanalee Design Studio. Thank you very much for joining me, and I'll see you all next time. Bye for now.